Hey, well, hello. Welcome to our lecture on Sumer, the first major civilization that we're going to be covering here in world history. And so you can see that Sumer, we got a basic date of 4000 BC for Sumer, which is the oldest civilization that we have, archaeologists and historians have uncovered. So as far as we know, the first gathering of human beings as a kind of a united civilization, which will define that, what a civilization is in fact Sumer, which has some pretty powerful implications for Genesis and for the Bible. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so our first topic here, we're going to always have three topics in the lecture and then a so what at the end, so as you're taking notes. But the first thing is the plains of Shinar. There's a region in which the civilization of Sumer exists or existed, and it's got a lot of names, and we want to make sure we understand that those are all the same places. So the plains of Shinar, that's basically what we call the Fertile Crescent, and we'll see if we'll click over. There's a map right here. I'll go back to that slide. But the Fertile Crescent is that what we might call the Middle East or modern day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and of course Israel and Lebanon. And it's called a crescent because you've kind of got basically two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then rivers heading down the coast there through Lebanon and Israel, that create an arable piece of land, fertile soil in which food can grow. And so, we believe the reason we'd have a civilization emerge here is because of the rivers and then the fertile soil that it produces and the ability to have a large, stable population because they can actually grow enough food versus just kind of having a subsistence hunter-gatherer civilization. And so key to the Fertile Crescent or the plains of Shinar are the Tigris and the Euphrates River. They are the life source of this Fertile Crescent. In fact, another name for this region besides plains of Shinar, Fertile Crescent, is Mesopotamia. That's a Greek word for the land between two rivers. And again, that's because you got the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and the first civilization that we know on the planet arising within the fertile soil of those two rivers. Another reference or another name, oftentimes the Fertile Crescent is referred to as the cradle of civilization because we are in fact talking about the first human civilization that we know existed on Earth. Okay, this is just a scripture from Genesis 10, in which where we get the name the plains of Shinar, because if you look at Genesis and you read about the rise of human civilization after the flood, after mankind is wiped out for their sinful acts, the rise of violence, you get that they say that it arose there in the plains of Shinar. And so interesting, one of the things we'll see is in Genesis itself agrees that the first human beings gathering in cities, and as a larger civilization happened in this region, the Fertile Crescent, or again Mesopotamia, or the cradle of civilization. And so again, here we see the map. You can see the Tigris and Euphrates extending out to the Gulf there, and then of course Israel there on the left. Just another look at the region we're talking about. This one you can see labeled there, Sumer, and you begin to see different cities. You might recognize the city of Babylon, or or Eridu. These are all city-states of the Sumerian civilization within that region and within the Sumerian civilization. Okay, what makes it a civilization? These doesn't necessarily mean we're saying these are the first human beings. Again, even in Genesis, you see there's human beings long before the flood. But what made it a civilization are these five characteristics that you need to note. They had specialization of labor. In other words, not everybody had to work to feed and supply everything themselves. You had certain people who could be farmers, certain people who could be bricklayers, certain people who could be artisans, certain people who could serve as priests. And so their labor was specialized. And so that's a sign of a civilization. They also have the first written language that we know of, cuneiform. And so that's a sign of a civilization. For it to be unified needs to have a written language that ties it together. They also have the first written law code. So laws that are not just traditions or customs or edicts carried out by elders, but it's actually written down. We call that being codified. It's codified. And so that we see that also with Sumer. A civilization must have civil government. So there's some sort of civil authority governing the civilization, not just maybe elders or a family or a certain father figure or something like that. No, you actually have a system of government. And we see this arise in ancient Sumer. And lastly, because of the specialization of labor, usually they have a stable food source. They're able to branch out into the arts and the sciences. and we'll look at some of the achievements of the Sumerian civilization in those areas. So those are 5 characteristics, not just of Sumer, but of any civilization. We here in the United States or the West have those characteristics, but Sumer is the first place we see that arising in world history. So their government, a couple things to note about how their government or their civil government was organized is that originally, from what we can tell, they actually started out as a democracy. They started out with councils. They started out where people could vote and choose a tribal or a city leader. But over time, and this is a huge historical trend that we will watch in countless civilizations, that democracy changed or moved into toward monarchy, and not only to monarchy, but towards absolute monarchy. In other words, a monarch who has total control over the society. In Sumeria, this was known as the Lugal, which translates as the big man. And so they had a city council, but overall, slowly, the city council lost their authority to this big man and just becoming one person who's in charge. And then that in turn would turn into the idea of a king. They had a class system. You had nobles who were related to the systems of government and the religion, and the king or the big man and the city council. You had commoners, clients. Clients would be outsiders, people who would kind of like foreigners. They would come and they would trade and they would conduct business within the cities or within the empire. And then, of course, it was a slave society. Slavery is old as human beings themselves. And they were, like every other civilization, almost up until medieval Europe, and then later the Enlightenment period, the 1800s, they were a slave society. Okay, this is just an illustration. This is, you can see the Fertile Crescent, another picture of the Tigris and Euphrates River. But all those red dots are what we call city-states, in that it started out, as I said, it started out kind of democratic. You would have all these individual cities, and each city was basically like its own country, and they would have their own religion, and they would have their own government, and they would have their own law code, obviously very related, but they were kind of independent. And then what makes Sumeria kind of arise as a unified civilization is over time, these city-states would unite, and one ruler would come to dominate all of them. But again, initially, they were a bunch of individual city-states. When we read in Genesis, we see that Abraham actually came from one of these city-states. You can see it there at the bottom, now down by the Persian Gulf. That is the historical homeland of the first Jew, Abraham, in the book of Genesis. So Abraham was a Sumerian. He was from this civilization, and we'll talk about God calling him out to create a new civilization that we today call the Jews or the Hebrews. Another interesting characteristic, and again, we're going to see a lot of ties between Sumeria and Genesis, where we have again a historical understanding of Sumeria, but then we also have what we see in the Bible of this first civilization, and it's amazing the crossovers. I just mentioned one, which is Abraham being from one of these cities that we know factually to be one of the earliest cities ever to exist on the planet. We also have the fact that the location, the Bible says that the first civilization arose in the Fertile Crescent. In fact, the Euphrates River is mentioned in the creation account of the Garden of Eden. And then we also have this thing called the Sumerian Kings List. And what you see there is the chart is a chart of the lifespans of the human beings according to Genesis, where again you have up until the flood human beings living upwards to 900 years, which again seems pretty supernatural, or to some people very mythological. And then after the flood, you see a rapid decline in their ages until we finally reach the standard human age of about 120 or 80 to 90 years old. What's interesting is that, again, separate from the Bible, is you have this thing called the Sumerian Kings List, and it lists their kings going way, way back into time, and you see the exact same pattern. That you see a pattern of the ages of the king, or actually it's the rule of the kings, and the rule of the kings are in the hundreds and hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden, at a certain point, they begin to drop down little by little, and all of a sudden they begin to be more of what we would see a standard kingly rule of maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 years of ruling. So again, not necessarily an absolute proof or anything. You don't see the same names on this king's list, but it's interesting that these two old sources, Genesis and then what we see at this first civilization, would have this same pattern of human beings with extremely long life and then rapidly declining into what we see to be what we now consider a standard lifespan. So again, one of those interesting crossovers between Genesis and the actual historical record. Another key aspect, by the way, notice we're on the second point, the first civilization. Just some key who's who's. There were basically three dynasties within the Sumerian civilization. You have what I mentioned, the old dynastic age. That's when the city-states were independent, pretty much ruled by their own king, and where they, again, sometimes they were at war, sometimes they would trade and have treaties, align with each other in different ways. And then you get Sargon, oftentimes called Sargon the Great, or he was an Akkadian from a certain region. He is the first to begin to unite these city-states. And so he's kind of considered, Sargon the Great, or Sargon of Akkad, is considered the first kind of major ruler in all of world history. The first guy to kind of look beyond his own tribe, look beyond his own city, and begin to build an empire. And so that's why he is then worth noting. And then they have kind of what's considered a golden age, where we get a lot of the scientific and artistic achievements, where we get a lot of our writing, the first writings that we begin to emerge. And that's the third dynasty of Ur. And Ur becomes a major player at that time. And again, interestingly enough, Ur being the city from which Abraham will leave to follow God's call. Religious now, speaking of their religion, it's important to note that the Sumerians were what we call naturalists. And you're going to do a reading based on this, but that they basically saw the world as enchanted. When they looked out and they saw the natural world, physical objects, nature, plants, the moon, stars, they saw it as being full of spirits. That behind the world, they thought everything was enchanted in that it was alive, it had its own soul, it had a personality, and it was something that you could almost commune with. They were polytheists. They believed in many, many gods. But interestingly, as they started with democracy and headed towards monarchy, each of these city-states started as monotheists. They started believing in one God. They had the one God of their city. And then as they began to interact or began to branch out, or you began to get cross-pollination between the different city-states of Sumer, they began to adopt more gods and be like, okay, we'll worship our God, and we'll worship the god of Ur, and the god of Eridu, and the god of Babylon, and the god of whatever city. And so by the end, they were major polytheists with over 2,500 gods, so what we call a pantheon of gods. But again, even that itself is an interesting tie-over between, the God of creation with his people, and then him calling them out, don't worship other gods, don't expand the worship of the one true God into the worship of many gods, don't fall into idolatry, which we see Israel doing multiple times in the Bible. But that itself is recorded as happening throughout this Sumerian, the history of the Sumerian civilization. Another key point we'll be making about these gods is that they begin to look a lot different than the God of Genesis, in that they are not immortal, they're not sovereign. There isn't the one sovereign God ruling and controlling and dictating things over all of creation. They're in competition with each other. They're in conflict. In fact, we read the Babylonian creation myth, in which the earth was created through warfare and from the dead carcass of a slain demon. And so you get lots of turmoil and conflict among these gods, and gods fighting each other. And when city-states would go to war, a lot of times they would say, well, we're going to determine whose god is stronger, because if we win, then we've defeated your god, or if you win, you've defeated our god. And another thing is the strength of the kings expands. We get what we call, and we'll talk about this all year long, what I call a god king. And that is when they began to worship men. They began to see not only gods in nature, or gods in the sun, or the moon, or the rivers. They began to see God in that ruler. Okay, you're the king, not just because you're the most powerful or the most wise. You're a king because you are standing in the place of God. And they began to worship their kings as having special relationship or even special attributes of the divine. Again, from a biblical perspective, not a good way to go. Okay, last section, contributions. So what contributions did Sumerian civilization make to us today? Huge one is writing. Writing is crucial to a civilization. In fact, if you say we're studying history, you're actually saying we are studying the written record. There is no history until there is writing, because history is the study of people's accounts of the past. And before people began to produce written accounts of the past, you can have archaeology, you can have geography, you can have geology, but you don't really have history technically until there is writing. And so a lot of times, what we're saying is that history begins with the Sumerian civilization, and also history kind of begins with Genesis, because until it's written down, you don't technically have the ability to to engage in the study of history. So writing's really important. And I always say, the word prehistoric, a lot of times we picture like, dinosaurs and volcanoes or cavemen, which, is not necessarily wrong. But when we say prehistoric, what I want you to think of is prehistoric means prior to history, or sorry, prior to writing, prior to the written record. Everything prior to before we have written records is what we would call prehistory for that reason, or prehistoric times. As it says up there, writing is crucial because it stabilizes your culture. You can actually pass information on. You can remember your past. You can teach it to your present. You can project it into the future. A lot of times their first writing was what we call pictographs. They did not use an alphabet, but they used something more like Japanese or Chinese pictographs, or even Egyptian hieroglyphics. They had a formal education system. That's the other key thing about writing, is it produces schools, because you got to teach that writing to the next generation. That's why you guys have English class, and also produces history class, so that we can begin to pass on this cultural information. Their school system there was called the Eduba. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that perfectly. There's just a picture of the cuneiform. That was their type of writing that's going to be used by multiple civilizations even after the Sumerians are gone. And you can kind of see the adaptation of progression of pictographs, where again, something would start out almost as a crude drawing of what it represented, and then it would slowly move into almost symbolic form. But again, it's not letters. It's not like you're arranging letters in an alphabet to create words like we do in English, but you are creating symbols that represent physical things or even ideas. And you can see here the way in which they wrote it was not with any kind of ink, but the cuneiform was pressed into a soft clay tablet, especially with that crescent shape being especially identifiable or representative. And then they would bake it, and it would harden, and then you would have a written copy of whatever the text was. So it wasn't an ink based; it was pressed into clay. Okay, just a laundry list of some of the firsts. Some of the first things that when human beings seem to have come up with them. The wheel, who invented the wheel? Well, as far as we know, the Sumerians. Some civilizations would never invent the wheel in other parts of the world, but it comes from Sumeria. They would have carts and eventually chariots. They raised sheep to use wool for their textile industry. Their architecture, they built domes. They built arches, which if you ever pick up some rocks and try to build an arch, that's a tricky piece of engineering. They had a math system. It was based on 60. We have a 10 base system, where every 10 it starts over. Theirs was a 60 base system. They had money, shekels and minas. Again, those are very familiar from what we read in Genesis and the Old Testament. They had again currency, where it wasn't just trade. It wasn't just I like this thing, you need have that. I'll give you a sheep for a cow, or some food for some wool. They actually had money that represented a stable form of exchange. That's a highly developed aspect of a civilization. They had a lunar-based calendar, so based on the cycles of the moon, the Jews would be the same. They also have a lunar calendar. The Chinese still have a lunar calendar. Jewelry, a law code. You'll have a whole separate lecture. Here on the right is that tall black thing, the obelisk. That is the Code of Hammurabi, which is one of the first law codes that we see codified in all of history. And the thing at the bottom is what we're talking about, or have talked about, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The first ancient piece of entertainment, piece of the story of Gilgamesh and his adventures trying to find eternal life, and his ultimate failure and need to face death. So literature, storytelling, the first ancient Marvel series. That's kind of a modern epic. All the Marvel movies put together. The Sumerians started that long ago with the Epic of Gilgamesh. Examples of the most notifiable or identifiable Sumerian architecture. These were pyramids called ziggurats. And so those have been excavated. They were likely centers of worship with sacrifices being conducted at the very top of them. Kind of a type of pyramid structure. Renditions of what we think they look like when they are actually being used. Very impressive. Very complicated engineering. You can imagine in the flat plains of the Middle East, that thing would stand out. That would look absolutely massive and be able to be seen from a long ways away, and would definitely project power and a sense of the divine. And also just all these crossovers where, again, is Genesis true? Is Genesis an accurate record of the start of history? It's amazing the countless crossovers. And even when we read the account in Genesis 11 of if I'm getting that right, of the Tower of Babel, you can almost read into that the civilization coming together in the plains of Shinar, the Fertile Crescent, to build towers that reach up to heaven, make a name for themselves. Well, the first people to make a name for themselves were the Sumerians, because they're the first civilization that we know about, and they too built towers that, again, I'm sure looked like they reached on up into heaven. And you can see the scale if you look at the little people on that ramp of how massive, even to us, if you walked up to one of these, it would be impressive. And would never have seen anything like it, and it would definitely look like it's reaching up into heaven. It even references the use of bricks and the kind of a new architectural method of creating and I think burning bricks so that they'd be strong enough to build such a massive structure. It's very likely. I mean, it's very believable that this text references the ziggurats of ancient Sumeria. And again, it's just the very beginning of tower building by human beings, whether we're going to talk the pyramids in ancient Egypt, or you have the pyramids of the Maya and the Aztecs over in Central America. So that's a trend of human beings trying to reach up to heaven in their attempt to worship, understand God, and reach him. Okay, we made it. Here's the last slide. This is your point 4. Big ideas. So why are we talking about the Sumerians? So what? I call this the so what, because it's like, why would we mention these things? There's so many things we could talk about. There they are. First, it's the first civilization. It's world history. We want to know, where did things get started? It's in the Fertile Crescent, the plains of Shinar, Mesopotamia. And it's, I think, very powerful that the Bible gets this right, that the Bible, where it says it began, it's right where it says it should be. Also, take away, again, what I've said about writing, that, again, what sets the Sumerians apart is that they're the oldest form of writing that we know. And so that is, they represent the beginning of history. The beginning of history, not of mankind necessarily, and even Genesis reflects that. There's 10 chapters prior to chapter 11 when they start to build the Tower of Babel. But it's the beginning of what we call history, which is the written record of past events. And finally, what I've tried to emphasize over and over again is it's powerful, I believe, the common culture and memory are the crossovers between Sumerian, the historical record of Sumeria, and what we see in the Bible. And that I think they definitely reflect a common culture or a common memory. Again, the Bible isn't necessarily a strict objective history book, but there's nothing in Genesis that contradicts what archaeologists and what historians have found looking back into prehistory and history. Whether it's the towers and the ziggurats, whether it's the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we're going to talk extensively about the crossovers between the Gilgamesh epic and some of the stories in prehistoric Genesis, or things like the Sumerians' Kings List, or even the rise from I'll add from monotheism to polytheism. All of these things are work together. And so another major theme of this is there's nothing in the historical record that contradicts the Bible. Sometimes that'll just get thrown out there, but no, in fact, the deeper you look, and the deeper I've looked, I didn't grow up learning this, but the deeper I've looked, the parallels and the consistency is remarkable and very encouraging and very exciting and interesting. So I'm sure you thought that. I'm sure you had a great lecture. Hopefully you got lots of notes, and we can discuss this when we meet this week. But there you go. The Sumerians, our first civilization.